My business partner got my wife pregnant and tried to steal my company. My mom knew and told me to raise the kid anyway. So I went nuclear and took everything back. All right, Reddit. I need you to strap and grab your popcorn. What you're about to hear is going to mess with your head. I'm Gavin, 40 male, and I live in coastal Georgia. For 12 years, I've been building a company called Tidewater Protective Coatings, LLC, out of a rented shop off Highway 25 near Garden City. Industrial coatings and corrosion control. If that means nothing to you, think about every steel structure within 50 miles of saltwater. Bridges, port cranes, storage tanks, water towers, ship components, pipeline supports. All of it rusts. All of it needs blasting, priming, and coating on a schedule or it falls apart. That was my business. Boring to most people. A gold mine if you know what you're doing. I knew what I was doing. Started the company at 28 with Sheldon Pratt. Shell and I went back to middle school in Rincon. Played ball together, got in trouble together, worked summers on the same shrimp boat out of Thunderbolt when we were 17. He was my best man when I married Corinne. I was his when he married his first wife, a relationship that lasted 11 months before she cleaned out their joint account and moved to Tallahassee with a bartender. When that happened, I drove down there with him to get his dog back because he was too wrecked to go alone. When I was 22 and flat broke after a layoff, Shell let me sleep on his couch for 3 months and never asked for $1. That was the kind of friendship we had, or the kind I thought we had. After his divorce, Shell stayed single, stayed hungry, and poured everything into the business alongside me. We split ownership 50-50, 2 equal members of the LLC. I handled operations, estimating, client relationships, and crew management. Shell ran field production. He was good with his hands, knew coatings chemistry better than most engineers, and could push a crew through a 12-hour containment job in August heat without losing a man. Corinne came into the picture 5 years into the business. Met her at a Chamber of Commerce mixer in Savannah that I didn't want to attend. She was working admin for a trucking outfit on the west side. Sharp, organized, good with numbers. We dated for about 6 months, got married at the courthouse, and within a few months after that, she was running our office. That wasn't my idea. It was Shell's. He pointed out we were bleeding money on a part-time bookkeeper who kept miscoding expenses and a temp who couldn't keep the filing straight. Corinne could handle payroll, vendor management, invoice processing, bank reconciliations, reimbursements, and client billing all from one desk. She'd save us 40 grand a year and do a better job than anyone we could hire. He was right. Corinne was excellent at the job. Within a year, she had our books tighter than they'd ever been, our vendor relationships organized, our billing cycle cut from net 45 to net 30 on most accounts. She set up the QuickBooks system, managed the company credit cards, handled the checking and savings accounts, processed payroll for our 15-man crew, and approved every purchase order that came through the door. She had the keys to the kingdom. Every financial door in the company, Corinne could open it without asking me or Shell for permission. I'll say this about Corinne because it matters for later. She wasn't some passive, go-along-to-get-along type. She was sharp in a way that could cut you if you weren't paying attention. Always knew exactly what to say, to make you feel like her idea was actually yours. Always knew when to push and when to pull back. When vendors tried to jack up prices, she'd negotiate them down with this quiet, firm tone that made grown men apologize for wasting her time. When crew guys submitted sloppy timesheets, she'd send them back with corrections and a look that made sure it didn't happen twice. I admired that about her. Shell and Corinne got along well from the start. At the time, it just seemed like a good fit. He'd come by the office to grab work orders. They'd chat about schedules, joke around, the normal stuff you'd expect from a small company where everybody's in each other's space. He started coming to dinner at our place every Saturday. Football Sundays in the fall became part of the routine. My wife, my best friend, my business partner, all sitting around my table eating shrimp and grits and talking about the week. I thought that was a good life. I was wrong. For about 3 years after Corinne took over the office, everything ran smooth. Revenue climbed from $1.8 million to just over $3 million. We landed a recurring maintenance contract with the Georgia Ports Authority for 2 container crane systems at Garden City Terminal, picked up bridge work for the county, got on the approved vendor list for 3 regional chemical plants, bought a second spray rig, a new blast pot, and a containment trailer, hired 4 more guys. I was proud. Built something real in a town where most people my age were working for someone else, or had already washed out. Corinne and I bought a house in Isle of Hope. Nothing fancy, just a 3-bedroom ranch on a half-acre lot with a dock on the marsh. Shell lived 10 minutes away in a duplex he'd been renting since his divorce. Everything felt solid. The business, the marriage, the friendship. Then the numbers stopped adding up. It started with a blast media invoice. We use steel grit and garnet for most of our abrasive blasting. Bulk orders, 40 to 60 tons at a time depending on the project load. I'd been tracking material costs loosely for years because Corinne handled the purchasing and I trusted her numbers. But in March, a vendor rep named Dale from our garnet supplier called me directly to thank me for the increased volume and ask if we wanted to negotiate a tiered discount. Increased volume. We hadn't increased volume. If anything, Q1 had been lighter than usual because 2 bridge jobs got pushed to April for permit issues. I pulled the purchase orders after the call. Corinne had been ordering garnet at roughly double our actual consumption rate for the past 7 months. The invoices were real. The vendor was real. The deliveries were logged, but the quantities didn't match what our crews were using on actual jobs. I checked the delivery addresses. Half the shipments went to our shop. The other half went to a storage yard in Pooler I'd never heard of. I drove out there on a Sunday. Industrial area off Pooler Parkway, chain link fence, gravel lot, a couple of shipping containers. Found 6 pallets of bagged garnet stacked under a tarp with our vendor's lot numbers on the packaging. Whoever was running this had been diverting our material here and selling it to smaller contractors at a markup. I took photos of everything, the lot, the pallets, the lot numbers, the address on the gate. Then I drove home and didn't mention it to anyone. That was the first crack. I didn't say anything. Not to Corinne, not to Shell. Years of running a business teaches you that the worst thing you can do when you suspect a problem is announce that you suspect a problem. You watch. You wait until you have enough information to act decisively. Over the next 3 weeks, I went through every vendor file Corinne managed. Did it at night after she went to sleep, copying invoices and statements onto a thumb drive from the shared office computer. What I found was methodical. A company called Low Country Equipment Solutions had been billing us for containment scaffolding rentals on projects where we owned our own containment gear. 7 invoices over 7 months, totaling just over $48,000. The company had a website, a phone number, and a P.O. box in Pooler. I called the number from a burner app on my phone. Nobody answered. I checked the Georgia Secretary of State business filings online. Low Country Equipment Solutions was registered 8 months prior. The registered agent was a name I didn't recognize. Qley Branton. I searched the name. Nothing. Dead end. Then I searched the P.O. box. Same box number showed up on the garnet overflow shipments. That's when my stomach dropped. Not because I'd caught a thief, because I realized the thief was someone I trusted completely, and I didn't yet know which one. 2 days after I found the P.O. box connection, Corinne came to me at the house with a manila folder. Said our liability insurance carrier wanted updated documentation. She needed me to sign a revised operating agreement that would streamline banking authorizations. Made it sound routine. Housekeeping stuff. I opened the folder. The revised agreement gave Corinne sole signatory authority on the company's primary checking and savings accounts, removing the existing requirement for a member co-signature on withdrawals over a certain threshold. It also adjusted the buyout clause in the operating agreement, replacing the mutual consent requirement for a forced sale with a provision allowing either member to trigger a buyout upon a finding of material breach. In practice, that meant if they could build a paper trail showing I'd violated some duty, real or fabricated, either one of them could force me to sell my member interest at whatever valuation they controlled. And with Corinne running the books, controlling the valuation wouldn't be hard. I read every page. Corinne watched me, leaning against the kitchen counter with that patient look she used when she wanted you to feel like you were overthinking something simple. The insurance guy needs it by Friday, she said. I closed the folder, told her I'd have my own guy look it over first, just to be safe. Standard practice. Something shifted behind her eyes. Then she smiled and said, "Sure, no rush," whenever I got around to it. Took the folder back and never mentioned it again. I hired a forensic accountant named Rhoda out of Jacksonville. CPA, CFE, 20 years experience in fraud cases involving small and mid-sized contractors. I gave her the thumb drive, explained the setup, and told her I needed a full picture before I confronted anyone. Rhoda took 2 weeks. During that time, I tested Corinne once. Casually, over breakfast, I mentioned the Pooler storage yard. Said one of the guys told me we had material sitting in a lot off Pooler Parkway, and I wanted to know what it was. Corinne didn't flinch. She put her coffee down and gave me this look, half annoyed, half amused. That's overflow from the Savannah River Bridge job. We didn't have room at the shop. I told you about this in January. She hadn't told me anything in January. I would have remembered authorizing storage costs at an off-site location, but she said it with such flat certainty that for about 3 seconds I wondered if I'd actually forgotten. Then she added, "I can pull the PO if you want, but honestly, I've got payroll and the GPA invoice to finish today. Can it wait?" Translation: "Stop asking questions and let me handle it." I told her it could wait, smiled, went to work. She handled it all right. By the time I checked the following week, the pooler delivery records in our system had been reclassified under a legitimate project code. She'd cleaned the trail. Not well enough for Rhoda, but well enough that a trusting husband would have never looked twice. What Rhoda found was worse than what I'd suspected. The fake vendor billings through Low Country Equipment Solutions totaled $48,000 over 7 months. But that was just one channel. Rhoda found padded invoices from legitimate vendors, where Corinne had inflated quantities and pocketed the difference. Reimbursement claims for fuel purchases at stations nowhere near our job sites. Padded payroll entries for 2 employees who hadn't worked on the dates listed. The garnet overages, when you tracked where the excess material actually went and who sold it on the secondary market, added another $28,000. And 3 client payments that had been rerouted to an account at a credit union in Hinesville that didn't belong to the company. The credit union account was in Sheldon Pratt's name. Rhoda laid it all out in a bound report with exhibits. $211,000 had been siphoned from Tidewater protective coatings over the past 11 months through a coordinated scheme that required both financial access and operational knowledge. One person handled the books. The other knew enough about our work to make the fake invoices look legitimate. Corinne and Shell. Together. Rhoda asked if I wanted her to stop there. I told her to keep digging. She found the Low Country Equipment Solutions registration, tracked down Qley Branton, Corinne's cousin on her mother's side, a 23-year-old nursing student in Statesboro who probably had no idea her name was being used to register a shell company. I sat in Rhoda's office looking at the report and felt something cold settle in my chest. Not rage, not grief, something quieter. The feeling of understanding exactly what was happening and knowing exactly what I was going to do about it. But I wasn't done finding things out. Fraud makes people sloppy. They get comfortable. That's how the rest of it came out. I had a security camera installed in the office. Standard security coverage in a common area. Posted notice. Video only, no audio. That's all I needed. 3 days in, I reviewed footage from a Thursday evening. Corinne had stayed late. She wasn't working. She was pacing near the filing cabinet, on the phone, relaxed and laughing. No audio, but I didn't need it. That laugh wasn't for a vendor. The next morning, I was on the shared iPad resetting a vendor login for the company accounts. A message preview popped up from Shell. One line was enough. He still has no idea about any of it. I almost feel bad. Almost. 4 days later, the camera caught Shell coming into the office at 9 p.m. Corinne was already there. I watched the feed on my phone from a motel room in Jessup, where I told Corinne I was staying for an early morning tank inspection. They didn't do anything for the first 20 minutes. Just went through files, moved papers around, printed something, business stuff, fraud stuff. Then they were on each other. Right there on the desk I'd built out of reclaimed lumber from a demolished warehouse on River Street, because I thought it had character. Before I closed the app, I rewound and paused on what they'd been printing, zoomed in on the pages sitting in the output tray. Couldn't read every word, but I could make out enough. It was the revised operating agreement. The same one Corinne had brought me 2 weeks earlier with the adjusted buyout clause and the banking authorizations. They'd been refining it, working on version 2, probably with language that would hold up better if I pushed back again. These two weren't just cheating. They were building a case to take my company. I watched long enough to confirm what I needed to confirm. Then I closed the app, set the phone down, and stared at the ceiling of the motel room for 2 hours without moving. My brain went back through every Saturday dinner, every handshake at the door, every look between them I'd dismissed, rewrote all of it, every single moment. The affair had been going on at least as long as the financial scheme, maybe longer. Shell had been to my house every weekend for the past year. Dinner on Saturdays, football on Sundays during the season. He'd sit at my table, eat food Corinne cooked, shake my hand when he left, and then apparently come back when I wasn't home. I spent the next week building my case, downloaded every piece of footage, backed up Rhoda's financial report to 3 separate locations, met with an attorney named Waylon Gatch, a litigation guy out of Savannah who specialized in business disputes and LLC dissolutions. Waylon reviewed everything, asked pointed questions, and laid out my options with the kind of calm precision I needed. During that same week, I caught something else. One of my foremen, a solid guy named Qley, who'd been with us 4 years, mentioned that Corinne had called the Port Authority project manager directly to reschedule our crane maintenance window, told the PM that I was overextended, and that she and Shell would be handling the coordination going forward. I called the PM myself. Casual, friendly, he confirmed it, said Corinne had been professional, said I was slammed with bids, and that Shell would be the primary point of contact for the next quarter. The PM didn't think anything of it. Just internal reshuffling. It wasn't reshuffling. It was positioning. She was moving me out of my own client relationships so that when the time came to cut me loose, the clients would already be used to dealing with Shell and Corinne. Smooth transition, minimal disruption, like I was the one being phased out of the company I built. I thanked the PM, told him I'd be handling things personally going forward, and made a note for Waylon's file. Then, Corinne told me she was pregnant. She did it over dinner on a Wednesday. Grilled shrimp, rice, the works. She was smiling in this careful, practiced way. Told me she'd been to the doctor that morning. 8 weeks along. I did the math before my fork hit the plate. 8 weeks put conception right around the time I was in Waycross for a 5-day pipeline job. I'd been gone Monday through Friday. Corinne had told me she was sick that whole week, stayed home from the office, barely texted. She wasn't sick. She was with Shell. I looked at her across the table and smiled. Told her that was great news. Hugged her. Said all the things a man says when he thinks he's about to be a father. I wasn't about to be a father, but I needed her to be comfortable and unsuspecting for what came next. There was one more thing I needed before I could move. I went to a walk-in clinic the following morning and got a full STI panel. Came back clean, which was the only piece of luck I'd had in months. Waylon Gatch and I met twice more that week. Laid out every step. Filed nothing yet. Signed nothing yet. Just prepared. Like rigging containment before you start blasting. You don't fire the nozzle until every seal is tight and every vent is in place. Otherwise, the dust goes everywhere and you lose control. I wasn't going to lose control. 2 weeks after Corinne's announcement, on a Saturday, I told my mother. Drove out to her place in Guyton, the same cinderblock ranch house I'd grown up in after my dad left when I was 6. She'd raised me alone, working the register at a feed store for 20-odd years. Never remarried, never complained. She was on the porch when I pulled up, sweet tea on the side table. She looked happy to see me, which made what I was about to say harder. I sat down and told her everything. The fraud, the affair, the pregnancy that wasn't mine. Showed her the financial report. Showed her the dates that proved the baby couldn't be mine. Didn't show her the video. She didn't need to see that. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a while. The fan kept spinning. Somewhere down the road, a dog was barking. Then she said, "How far along is she?" I told her. 10 weeks. She nodded, folded her hands in her lap, looked out at the yard. "I've been waiting for you to have a child. You know that. I've waited years." I said I knew. "So here's what I think. Forget the DNA. Forget who did what. Raise the baby as yours. Let me be a grandmother. That's what matters here. Not who slept with who." I looked at her for a long time. Then I said, "Are you serious? I'm not raising that kid. Don't ask me again." She didn't stop. She leaned forward in her chair and said it wasn't about me. Said it was about family. Said a child doesn't choose how it comes into the world, and neither should I punish an innocent baby because 2 adults did something wrong. Said she'd help. Said she'd be there every day if I needed her. Said the baby deserved better than what Corinne and Shell could give it, and that I was the kind of man who could step up even when things weren't fair. I stood up. Didn't yell. Didn't argue further. There was nothing left to discuss. She called after me from the porch. I heard her voice crack. Heard the chair scrape as she stood up. I drove away. 45 minutes back to Isle of Hope on back roads. Didn't turn the radio on. Pulled into my driveway, went inside, opened the hall closet, and took down every framed photo of my mother that hung in the house. 4 of them. Put them in a cardboard box, taped it shut, and set it in the garage next to the recycling. Over the next 2 days, she called 9 times. Texted paragraphs. Apologized, then doubled down. Said she didn't mean it the way it sounded. Then said she did mean it, and I was being selfish. Then cried and said she was scared of being alone. I read every message, responded to none. On the 3rd day, I called the utility company and canceled the autopay I'd been running for her electric bill for the past 7 years. Called her cell carrier and removed her from my family plan. Stopped the monthly transfer I'd been sending to help cover her rent since she retired. She noticed within a week. Called me 14 times in 1 day. I didn't pick up. She drove to my house. I wasn't there. She went to the office. Corinne told her I was on a job site. That was the last time I initiated or received any communication from my mother. I executed everything in 1 week, Monday through Friday. Planned it like a shutdown project. Every step sequenced, every contingency mapped. Monday morning, Waylon Gatch filed an ex parte emergency motion for a temporary restraining order, freezing all Tidewater business accounts pending a forensic audit. The motion argued immediate risk of asset dissipation given that 2 individuals with direct account access were actively siphoning funds and had already demonstrated a pattern of covering their tracks. It included Rhoda's report, bank records, the fake vendor documentation, and an affidavit from Dale at the Garnet supplier confirming delivery discrepancies. The motion also sought injunctive relief, granting me temporary sole operational control of the LLC and barring Corinne and Shell from the premises pending a full hearing. The judge signed the emergency TRO before lunch. Hearing set in 10 days, but that was all the time I needed. Monday afternoon, I walked into the office where Corinne was processing invoices and handed her a sealed envelope. Inside was a formal notice of termination from Tidewater Protective Coatings, LLC, effective immediately, along with a demand letter for restitution of all misappropriated funds. She opened it, read the first page, and her face went white. Then she flipped to the second page, the one with Rhoda's summary figures attached, and I watched her eyes track to the Low Country Equipment Solutions line item. That was when she knew exactly how much I knew. 2 of my crew guys were in the shop bay 20 feet away, loading the spray rig for a Tuesday job. They stopped what they were doing, watched through the open door. Nobody said a word. She started talking. I walked out. Nothing she had to say would change anything, and I'd learned months ago that her voice was just a tool she used to manage people. Tuesday morning, a locksmith hit the shop at 6 a.m. New deadbolts on every door, new codes on the alarm system, court order in hand, every bit of it legal. Then, Wayland filed a civil suit against Sheldon Pratt for breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, conversion, and unjust enrichment, including a civil RICO claim seeking treble damages and attorney's fees. The suit sought dissolution of the LLC, full accounting of all diverted funds, and forfeiture of Shell's member interest. Shell was served at the duplex by a process server at 7:15 a.m. I know because Wayland confirmed it by 7:30. Shell called me 11 times that day. I didn't answer. He showed up at the shop around 2 p.m. The locks I'd changed that morning kept him out. Shell stood in the parking lot, pulling on a door that wouldn't open, and I watched from inside through the window blinds. Same parking lot where we'd shaken hands years ago and said, "Let's build something." He saw me watching, started yelling, pounding on the glass. I turned around and went back to the bit I was working on for a water tower recode in Effingham County. Eventually, he left. Wednesday, I filed for divorce. Irreconcilable differences, but the filing included a detailed exhibit of the affair evidence and financial fraud as grounds for equitable distribution in my favor. Georgia's a no-fault state, but judges still consider misconduct when dividing assets. Wayland made sure every exhibit was clean, documented, and devastating. That same morning, I had the house locks changed. New deadbolt on the front door. New code on the garage. Wayland had advised securing the residence the same day as the filing, and the timing was deliberate. Wednesday evening, Corinne showed up at the house. I'd expected this. She stood in the driveway and tried the front door, which wouldn't budge. She knocked, then pounded, then called my name through the door. When I didn't answer, she sat on the porch steps for an hour. I watched from the back of the house through a window facing the driveway. Same way I'd watched Shell at the shop. She wasn't crying. A woman who'd been caught cheating would cry. A woman who'd been caught stealing would panic. Corinne was doing neither. She was sitting there thinking, running scenarios, calculating her next move. She finally left. The divorce papers were waiting at her friend's address the next morning. Thursday, Rhoda's report was formally submitted as a criminal referral to the Chatham County DA's office. Theft by deception, identity fraud for using Qley Branton's name without consent, and theft by conversion. Wayland didn't promise charges would be filed, but he said the case was clean enough that a prosecutor would at least look at it seriously. Friday, I met with every active client Tidewater had. In person where possible, by phone where not. Explained there had been internal financial irregularities, that my business partner was no longer with the company, and that all existing contracts would be honored by me personally, with no interruption in service. I brought the Port Authority project manager a folder showing the audit trail and our corrective action. He shook my hand and said he appreciated the transparency. Not one client left. Every single contract stayed. That Friday was also the day Corinne played her last card. She had her attorney contact Wayland with what amounted to a threat dressed up in legal language. Corinne was pregnant. She would be claiming the child was mine unless I agreed to a more favorable divorce settlement. She wanted the house, 60% of the business value, and 18 months of spousal support. In exchange, she wouldn't pursue a paternity claim that would, at minimum, create a legal presumption of fatherhood and tie me to child support for 18 years. Wayland called me, read me the letter, asked how I wanted to respond. I told him to respond with 3 things. First, I wasn't signing the birth certificate or any paperwork that could be twisted into acceptance. Wayland would be filing to contest paternity and requesting court-ordered DNA testing immediately after the birth. Second, any attempt to fraudulently establish paternity would be met with a countersuit for fraud. Third, I had time-stamped evidence proving I was over 100 miles away during the week of conception, along with the affair footage establishing the actual father's identity. Corinne's attorney withdrew the threat within 48 hours. The leverage she thought she had evaporated the moment she realized I'd been documenting everything, not just the money, but the timeline, the travel records, the hotel receipts from Waycross, all of it. By Friday evening, Shell had no business, no income, no access to any accounts. A civil suit demanding repayment of over $200,000 plus treble damages. A potential criminal investigation. Corinne had no job, no access to the books she'd used to steal from me. A divorce filing that painted her as a co-conspirator in financial fraud. And a pregnancy she could no longer use as leverage. I went home Friday night, sat on my dock, and watched the tide come in across the marsh. First quiet evening I'd had in months. The next several months played out like gravity doing its job. The divorce moved fast on temporary orders. The judge entered interim rulings within weeks, granting me exclusive possession of the house, sole control of the business, and freezing joint accounts pending final resolution. Corinne's attorney tried to argue she was entitled to half the business value and spousal support given her pregnancy. Wayland countered with the fraud documentation, showing she'd already extracted well over $100,000 from the company illegally. The judge was not sympathetic to Corinne's position on the temporary orders and set the final hearing for after the birth so the paternity question could be resolved. Corinne had the baby a few months later. A boy. He was born with a serious congenital heart issue that meant surgery early and ongoing specialist care. The kind of thing that eats money and requires stability she didn't have. Within days of the birth, Wayland filed for court-ordered paternity testing. I hadn't signed the birth certificate or any paperwork that could create a presumption. The test confirmed what I already knew. The baby wasn't mine. Shell was the father. With the test results in hand, the court entered an order removing any presumption of my legal responsibility for the child. Wayland made sure that paperwork was airtight. The final divorce decree came down shortly after the paternity results were filed. I kept the house, the business, and 80% of joint assets. She got her car and personal belongings. No alimony. The judge cited her documented role in the financial fraud as a significant factor in the distribution. She delivered at Memorial in Savannah, alone. Shell wasn't there. My mother wasn't there. Her cousin Qley, the one whose identity she'd used for the Shell company, had cut her off completely after the fraud came to light. The civil suit against Shell took longer. His attorney tried to argue the operating agreement was ambiguous about fiduciary duties, and that some of the transactions were legitimate. But our operating agreement, the original one I'd insisted on when we formed the LLC, had an explicit clause requiring mutual written consent for any vendor relationship exceeding $10,000 annually, and prohibiting either member from holding undisclosed financial interests in any company doing business with Tidewater. Shell had violated both provisions repeatedly. Rhoda's forensic report dismantled every remaining argument. The Shell company, the fake invoices, the rerouted payments, all of it was documented down to the penny. Shell settled before trial for the full restitution amount plus $60,000 in damages. He didn't have the cash. He signed over his truck, his boat, his savings, and agreed to a 5-year payment plan on the remainder. Wayland attached a lien to the settlement agreement to protect our position. The DA's office declined to prosecute. Not enough resources for the case size, they said. Wayland wasn't surprised, said criminal charges in financial fraud cases against individuals were always a long shot without a motivated prosecutor. But the civil judgment was on public record, and in this industry, that's a death sentence. I restructured Tidewater as a single-member LLC, hired a new bookkeeper, a retired Navy chief named Odell, who'd spent 20 years managing supply logistics on destroyers and didn't have a creative bone in his body. Perfect. I wanted boring, competent, and honest. Odell was all three. I also hired a full-time office administrator named Priya, who handled scheduling and client communications. Kept the same field crews. The guys who worked for me knew something had gone down, but they were blue-collar guys who understood that personal business stays personal. Nobody asked questions. Everybody showed up on time. Business actually improved after the split. Without shell skimming and Corinne padding invoices, our actual margins were better than I'd realized. I bid more aggressively on 3 new contracts and won all of them. Landed a maintenance agreement with a paper mill in Rincon. Picked up a 5-year bridge coating program with the county. Revenue climbed past $3.5 million. Shell's life went the other direction. Without the business income, without any clients, without a reputation, he scrambled. Tried to start his own coating outfit. Nobody would hire him. Word gets around in industrial contracting. One of my guys told me Shell showed up at the paper mill in Rincon with a bid package. Same mill I just landed a contract with. The plant manager looked at the bid, looked at Shell, and told him to leave the property. Didn't even open the envelope. Just handed it back and pointed at the gate. Shell sat in his truck in the parking lot for 20 minutes before he drove off. The plant manager called me that afternoon to let me know. Said he thought I should be aware. I thanked him and got back to work. He ended up taking day labor on a commercial roofing crew. Manual work, 60-hour weeks, low pay. About a year and a half after I locked him out of Tidewater, he was on a job site in Brunswick when a section of staging collapsed under him, fell 9 feet onto a concrete pad, herniated 2 discs in his lower back, L4 to L5 and L5 to S1. The kind of injury that doesn't heal right even with surgery, and Shell didn't have insurance because the roofing outfit paid him under the table. He got surgery eventually, some charity care program at Memorial, but the recovery was slow and incomplete. Chronic pain, limited mobility, couldn't lift, couldn't climb, couldn't do the physical work he'd built his whole identity around. The guy who used to carry 80-pound blast pots up scaffolding like they were grocery bags now couldn't bend over to tie his own boots. Last I heard, he was living in a trailer park outside Jessup, collecting disability checks that barely covered rent, and couldn't stand for more than 20 minutes without sitting down. I didn't feel good about that, didn't feel bad either. He put himself in a position where he had no insurance, no savings, no safety net, because he'd spent a decade's worth of goodwill stealing from the one person who'd have caught him if he fell. She tried to get child support from Shell, filed in family court. Child support took priority over my civil judgment on his wages, but it didn't matter much. Shell was on disability and barely working. The court calculated what he could pay based on his actual income, not what he used to make. She got a court-ordered $214 a month from a man who could barely stand, let alone hold down a real job. $214 a month for a baby with a heart condition that needed specialist care she couldn't afford. She moved in with a friend from high school, then moved out after 2 months when the friendship couldn't handle the weight of a newborn, with medical needs and a mother with no income. Then moved to an apartment complex in Midway, a place I only know about because she tried to list me as an emergency contact on the baby's medical forms, and the hospital called to verify. I told them I had no relationship with the patient or the mother, and asked them to remove my information. Corinne had burned every bridge she had. Shell was broken and broke. My mother, last I'd heard, had tried reaching out to Corinne once and been told to stay away. Even the people who enabled them didn't want to be around the wreckage. 3 years out now. I'm 40. Tidewater is running clean and profitable. 12 full-time employees, 2 spray rigs, house paid off, business debt-free. I'm pricing out a new blast rig that would let us take on offshore platform work. I met a woman named Josette 8 months after the divorce was final. Marine surveyor, works with cargo insurers. We've been together for 2 years now, living in the Isle of Hope house, which I kept, and which has no trace of Corinne left in it. My mother is still alive as far as I know. She's tried reaching me a few times over the years. Letters returned, messages shut down, left one voicemail on an old number saying she was sorry. I believe her. Doesn't change what she asked me to do. Shell reached out once, about a year ago. Handwritten letter to the office. I didn't open it. Put it through the shredder the same way I'd shred a junk mail flyer. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if Dale never called about the Garnet volumes. How long it would have gone on. How much more they would have taken. Doesn't matter. He called. I listened. I moved. Guys, we are so close to hit 100,000 subscribers on this channel. If you are not subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing. It really helps hit that 100,000 mark. Thanks for making this dream come true. Every active client Tidewater had. In person where possible, by phone where not. Explained there had been internal financial irregularities, that my business partner was no longer with the company, and that all existing contracts would be honored by me personally, with no interruption in service. I brought the Port Authority project manager a folder showing the audit trail and our corrective action. He shook my hand and said he appreciated the transparency. Not one client left. Every single contract stayed. That Friday was also the day Corinne played her last card. She had her attorney contact Waylon with what amounted to a threat dressed up in legal language. Corinne was pregnant. She would be claiming the child was mine unless I agreed to a more favorable divorce settlement. She wanted the house, 60% of the business value, and 18 months of spousal support. In exchange, she wouldn't pursue a paternity claim that would, at minimum, create a legal presumption of fatherhood and tie me to child support for 18 years. Waylon called me, read me the letter, asked how I wanted to respond. I told him to respond with 3 things. First, I wasn't signing the birth certificate or any paperwork that could be twisted into acceptance. Waylon would be filing to contest paternity and requesting court-ordered DNA testing immediately after the birth. Second, any attempt to fraudulently establish paternity would be met with a countersuit for fraud. Third, I had time-stamped evidence proving I was over 100 miles away during the week of conception, along with the affair footage establishing the actual father's identity. Corinne's attorney withdrew the threat within 48 hours. The leverage she thought she had evaporated the moment she realized I'd been documenting everything, not just the money, but the timeline, the travel records, the hotel receipts from Waycross, all of it. By Friday evening, Shell had no business, no income, no access to any accounts. A civil suit demanding repayment of over $200,000 plus treble damages. A potential criminal investigation. Corinne had no job, no access to the books she'd used to steal from me. A divorce filing that painted her as a co-conspirator in financial fraud. And a pregnancy she could no longer use as leverage. I went home Friday night, sat on my dock, and watched the tide come in across the marsh. First quiet evening I'd had in months. The next several months played out like gravity doing its job. The divorce moved fast on temporary orders. The judge entered interim rulings within weeks, granting me exclusive possession of the house, sole control of the business, and freezing joint accounts pending final resolution. Corinne's attorney tried to argue she was entitled to half the business value and spousal support given her pregnancy. Wayland countered with the fraud documentation, showing she'd already extracted well over $100,000 from the company illegally. The judge was not sympathetic to Corinne's position on the temporary orders and set the final hearing for after the birth so the paternity question could be resolved. Corinne had the baby a few months later,